Welcome everybody. Welcome to the forum. Welcome to the Friends Online. The first thing that I would like to do is to thank the festival and the director Isabel Gattiker for having us tonight. As you have understood, this forum is going to take place in English, but during the question and answer part of the forum, we're going to take questions in French, and our guests have got headphones and translation. They are here. So before I go into the details, well, as the tradition of the festival goes, there is not a direct link between the movie and the title of our forum. Actually, for some of us, this could be quite an intellectual gymnastic to link A Night of Knowing Nothing with the title of our forum, which is Why is it so hard for human beings to respect human rights? And perhaps for some of you, the link is obvious and you have already made it. Before I continue, I would like to introduce our guests tonight. I will start with Kate Gilmore, former Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations, Vice President of Interpeace and Professor at the London School of Economics and the Faculty of Law at University of Essex. Good evening, Kate. I will continue with Professor Naif Al-Rodan. At my right is a neuroscientist, philosopher, and geostrategist, and my neighbor close to the Graduate Institute at the GCSP, Irene Brunaseu, on my right as well, Professor of Critical Psychology at the University of London, and Professor Richard Wrangham, anthropologist and primatologist. My name is Davide Rodogno, and I teach international history and politics at the Graduate Institute here in Geneva. So, I will ask our guests a couple of questions, and then we're going to go through for more or less 1 hour, and then we're going to open up the floor to you all. And I would like to ask the same question to the four of you, probably because you do come from such a different, diverse kind of horizons. And I would like to hear, really starting from Kate and her experience with the UN as Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. I mean, let's discuss the title of this forum. Why is it so hard for human beings to respect human rights? Is it so hard, and hard for who exactly?
Yeah, it's actually, well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so very much for the privilege. It was a moving, confronting and disturbing film that we just shared together, and I'm just so enormously grateful that we could share it together after many months of not being able to do such a thing. It's a great question, actually. Why are human beings so bad at human rights? It's a great question because I thoroughly disagree with it. It's a great question because it's wrong, and it's perfect for debate. To the contrary, human rights are the essence of being human. It is an attempt to put words on the page to describe the very intrinsic nature in a social milieu, in a social way, of being human. However, it is a relational description. It's not about my intrinsic worth versus your intrinsic worth. It is an aspirational description of our mutual worth and of the mutuality of responsibility to uphold each other's worth. Where human rights have gone astray in so many ways, and we saw it throughout the film, is in the hands of power. Human rights is a mediation between the powerful and the powerless, and it's power that is appalling at upholding human rights. It is the powerful who have failed to respect human rights. It is the expression of power against relative powerlessness that violates human rights, and that is where the incompetence and the disrespect and the disregard for human rights lies, not in human beings per se.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to go back to some of the points that you made. I will ask exactly the same question to you, Naif. Please.
Thank you. Why is it hard for people to respect human rights? Because it is hard. And the difficulty is multifactorial. It starts with the individual, because we have inner neurobiological predilections that are relevant. There are societal constructs that are limiting, and I can come back to that later. And there are, on the macro level, there are geopolitical machinations that actually get in the way of human rights, in a nutshell.
Right, so we're moving from one level and scale of analysis to something else, and I will ask exactly the same question to you, Irene Bruna.
Thank you. And again, like Kate said, thanks ever so much for this amazing event and for inviting me, and it's been a real pleasure and a great honor. And thanks for all of you really participating in it. So my first objection to the question is that immediately, and I'm sure this was not intended, draws attention to the perpetrator. And I think there is a real issue there, because it feeds again into an interest in the perpetrator as the demonized, different from us, that does these terrible things, and really breaks down the connections. And I will keep coming back to this idea of disconnecting from things. And it so easily can feed into a narrative about human rights, human nature. It's just human nature. We do this because it's easier for us to think and to protect those that are near us. It's harder to understand those who are distant. So the idea of a narrative, I think, again, is a very important element in trying to understand why it is so difficult sometimes to have a different imaginary about human rights and how to respect them. And again, the other bit about why is it so hard, which is about the hard wiring, which was also another question that came with it. Again, I have questions and resistance to that, partly because, again, it feeds into this essentialist view of humans, takes away agency, and really takes away the most important question for me, which is not so much what are we capable or not, because humans are capable of great, benign, compassionate, and selfless acts, as of the most cruel and darkest thing that we can do to each other. We're capable of both. The question for me is, under which conditions does one come out and the other one gets repressed? And the narrative, I think, is a very important part in this, and it connects us to us, because we're all involved, and human rights are a responsibility for all of us.
Thank you. Richard, what do you make of this question?
Thank you, David, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I am an evolutionary biologist, so I think about humans as one more species. I study chimpanzees, and I think about differences between humans and chimpanzees, and also some similarities. And I survey the small-scale societies that give us a sense of where our own evolutionary psychology came from. And doing that, it gives me a very cynical sense of some aspects of humans. And let me give just two examples. The first is that if we think about people living in small-scale societies who are in charge of their own lives with nobody else helping them in some small group, then all around the world you will find that there are people who call themselves by a name that means human. And other people are not human. If we go back into our past, as represented by the small-scale societies that we know of, we have to face the notion that dehumanization was not necessary because it already existed. And people were randomly killed if they were members of another society. So that's a very gloomy perspective. And then again, if you think about the relationships between men and women, in every society we have on earth, it is the case that men as a group are institutionally, socially, in a position where they subordinate women as a group. This is true even though, as Catherine McKinnon has said, in more than 95% of societies on earth today, constitutionally, men and women are equal. But in practice, they are not. And it's astonishing to me that we look at the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and we see the word brotherhood. We see the word his 20 times. We don't see sisterhood. We don't see her. So, in short, my second point is that we are a species in which there is a very substantial exaggeration of male values at the expense of female values. And so for those reasons, I think it's terrific that we are asking the question about, is it hard to sustain human rights? Because I think we are blessed with an evolutionary psychology that sets us off in the wrong direction. And what's so exciting about concern of human rights is that we are moving away from that and we are generating the kinds of institutional, cultural, social, traditional attitudes that enable us to escape that past.
Okay, after this first round of questions, I think we could go on for forever, and I thank you very, very much for pointing out a number of things. I just want to get back to a couple of things that were said, and I would like to connect two things that Bruna and Kate said. The first has to do with the role of power when it comes to respecting human rights, and the second one has to do with the human condition. And so the exogenous factors that allow, human rights to be respected or disrespected. And I would like both of you perhaps to dialogue, and I will ask you, the other guests, a second question in a second. Kate.
I very much appreciated actually the interventions from esteemed panelists because they clarified a point. The human rights weren't drafted only in modern times. There's an enormous length of legacy across societies and history and era of efforts by the family or the human family to articulate norms and standards by which community and society can be held. And in fact, even with regards to notions of gender equality, rights between men and women, over centuries that has been debated and discussed and contested and affirmed. As long ago as before the Common Era China, it was Confucius who allegedly said that a woman is not worth 1/100th of a testicle. Now, that's a very interesting metric, 1/100th of a testicle. It's not one I've used in my own life, but no doubt it had particular meaning at the time. It always struck me that Confucius felt honour bound to describe the worth of a woman because apparently there must have been someone contesting his measure of a woman. You don't go about asserting and defending a position on the status of women unless somebody needs to be corrected in their misassumption that women might have been worth 5 parts of a testicle, or perhaps as much as half a testicle. Now, that's a hell of a long tradition of debating the nature of rights and worth and merit of a woman versus a man. And I would go so far as to say it is evidence that in every era, in every society, this conversation has been had. What is your worth relative to mine? What is the grouped worth of you, a Muslim versus a Hindu, a young person versus an old person, a refugee from Ukraine versus a refugee from Syria? These are conversations as old of time. And our better angels, and goodness knows, we have plenty that create our worse angels, but our better angels have said, we can resolve together our determination that, as the Declaration of Human Rights says, born we all are free and equal in dignity and rights. It was handsome Metta of India who made sure it didn't say all men are born free and equal in dignity and rights. She insisted that it said, and it commenced, and of course it then became the more popular vernacular general verbiage of the time, brother and men, but it actually says, born we all are free and equal in dignity and rights. And for me, this is a perpetual motion in the human family, to appeal to the better angels, to find an arrangement, a set of rules by which my impulse cannot trump your impulse, and your impulse cannot damage and hurt that which is mine. And we've called that, entre nous, rights. That's what rights are about.
Thank you. Great intervention. So I was going to go in a completely different direction, but I'll follow the flow. And I want to go back to the idea of power, which is absolutely essential, and the dehumanization, which also very essential. So what I would say to that is that when we think about exercise of power, I think we have a certain imaginary. But actually nowadays, a lot of the power is exercised through the war of narratives. And we can see in so many conflicts that have ended up in ethnic cleansing, genocide, and the absolute brutal attack on particular groups, the way the narrative builds up. And it's always the same. It's always breaking down the kind of commonness, similarity between human beings, the same nature and the same rights, to begin to introduce the ideas of us and them. And of course, the qualities of the us and them are very specific to the situation, but the pattern and the dynamic is always the same. So there is an accusation of a particular crime or a particular pattern of action, and then it becomes more personal. It becomes qualifying what these people are like. And the more one goes into that, the more we get near to sort of likening people to, for example, vermin. Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen this, for example, in Europe. A lot of the rhetoric about refugees is this invasion of vermin, that they're going to take away all these important things that we fought so hard, and they have no right, and they're different from us. And in a way, I mean, thinking about evolution, it's so depressing to think, really? Are we still doing this? But we are. And when we go back to the responsibility that I feel very strongly about, it's in combating these narratives, seeing them when they begin to emerge and to raise their ugly heads and say, oh, this is reminiscent. I see a pattern developing here. And to recognize that they might be very specific, but they are the same. And we have a responsibility for that. And that's one of the many important ways in which we can support and defend human rights. Saying, no, this is another way of looking at this. Dehumanizing the other is a key, I think.
But then allow me to be a little bit provocative and ask a different question to the other two guests. So if this... You see the appearance of this pattern, but listening to you, this is a very recent pattern, and actually the way backward is absolutely possible. So would it be really possible to imagine a world without human rights? And I will ask this question to both of you, as unfolding the pattern of responsibility that Bruna was evoking just a second ago.
So you're asking if it's possible to imagine a world without human rights. Well, I guess if I understand you correctly, you're thinking about a world in which we do not work for human rights.
Absolutely.
And try and obtain them. We can imagine it. It would be appalling. We see it sometimes in the aftermath of revolutions. We see it, in Libya after Gaddafi was killed. And in that process, suddenly you get a whole series of small militias in which a series of units of men are behaving in ways that are all too classical in terms of human experience. People say that, it has been said, as a George Santayana, that the lesson of history is that you don't learn anything from history. But that's wrong. We've learned tremendous amount from history. And the move towards, I want to say the move towards human rights, because, we're not there yet. But the move towards human rights is just so important because it's part of a credible, sustainable future for the species. My own view is very cynical about men. It seems to me that much more has to be done to enable gender to be a much less important feature of human inequality. Lord Acton said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and he went on to say great men are almost always bad men. And that seems to be right. We don't yet have enough of a sample, I think, for women to be able to say whether or not great women are always bad women. But my sense is that if you tie these things together, the important thing is that we try and avoid anybody having really large power, because the human species is given, just like any other animal species probably would be, to using power selfishly.
And with selfishly I turn, because I know that you're a specialist on this one, to you, Nayef.
Okay, thank you. So my background is philosophy, neuroscience, and international relations. So I'm going to mix and match all of the above. I'll go back to what I said initially, where human rights lie. I think the responsibility for success and failure lie at the individual level, at the state level, and the global level. So at the individual level, I mentioned that we have innate neurobiological predilections, and my work that's been published extensively, my view of man is that we are emotional, amoral egoists. Please don't throw anything at me just yet. Hear me out. It turns out that we're far more emotional than rational. That's a fact. And it also turns out that emotionality and rationality are not this dichotomous interplay, but it turns out that from clear neuroscientific work and neuroimaging work, that actually emotionality is a part and parcel of the most rational of decisions we make. And we are amoral at best. So we can be immoral, and we can be moral, but it turns out that most of us, most of the time, are amoral creatures, which means that our moral compass is malleable and variable according to our personal and political circumstances. And to me, our moral compass, which is relevant to human rights, is governed primarily by what I call perceived emotional self-interest. So you can perceive incorrectly and sabotage whatever you want to accomplish. And of course, egoism is self-interest. As a subset of that, so this is who we are. Now, does that mean we are condemned to immoral, selfish acts? No, we can aspire to great things, but I've said in my various writings, we must never be complacent about the virtues of human nature. We can be noble, but we can be absolutely horrible. And even the most grounded and enlightened of us are capable of both. So let's not forget that we are saintly. And it turns out when we are afraid or alienated or pressured, we don't do very well. we can shift to the other side of the curve very quickly. So that's on the individual level. The motivation of man, which is a subset that I've worked on, is what I call the Neuro P5. And the Neuro P5, so what motivates all of us, most of the time, if not all of the time, are 5 things. I heard power. Power is the first thing. And I'll come back to that because that's a highly addictive enterprise. Power, pleasure, profit, pride, and permanency. And what I mean by permanency is longevity as well as legacy. Now, power, I've just written a book last month. You can look it up if you want. It's called On Power, Neurophilosophical Foundations and Policy Implications. And and I've looked throughout human history and also looked at modern neurobiology. It turns out that power is an extremely addictive enterprise. It appears to be a psychological enterprise, but it actually at the end, it's a highly addictive neurochemical process that's no different than anything else. So, but it turns out that unless you taste power, you don't get addicted to it. But the minute you realize how good it feels, we call it in neurochemical terms the ultimate high. It is unrivaled. And that's why people in power would rather die than give it up. And they do die rather than give it up. Why? Because it is so thrilling. And they cannot imagine a life beyond that. So that's the individual level. So does that mean we're capable of doing good to our fellow beings? That's the question. Yes, we are, but under certain conditions. We are not selfless. We can, and there's no evidence actually that we have innate morality. We may have innate moral sensitivities, which is different. So under certain circumstances, we can cooperate, but there has to be something in it for us, knowingly or unknowingly. So pure altruism doesn't exist. In my various writings, I've called it pseudo-altruism. So it's always predicated on certain self-interest, even if it's emotional, even if it's perception. Let me go quickly to the state level. It turns out that actually the educational system, electioneering sound bites, the gaming industry, the entertainment industry, a skewed view of your own history, and more dangerously, a skewed view of someone else's history, is the perfect mix to dehumanize somebody else. And you cannot unring the bell. You cannot undo something that's being said. So it's the state and the social construct, I think, is highly responsible for minimizing the worth of someone else. I'll come back to that if you want later, because that's really important. I'll go to the macro level, which is the global system. The global system is a self-help, what we call in international relations terms, self-help system. There is no overarching authority that is just and peaceful. It doesn't exist. The national interest of states demands that the state aspire to achieve its interest at all cost. We hear all the nice things being thrown away, human rights, justice, liberal ideas. All of it is true until it crashes with the national interest. And the sad thing, which is what I mentioned in the beginning, which is what I call the geopolitical machinations, is that often the very sacred idea of human rights is misused for narrow geopolitical concerns. And therefore, whenever that's over, it pollutes the sanctity of human rights. And countries will do it all the time. Plus the narratives that you hear are very skewed, very confusing, and actually are the perfect prerequisite to dehumanizing someone else. So the responsibility lies at the individual level because of our predilections. That's who we are. We can do something about it through parenting, through the school system, through cultural frameworks. The state is the major responsible actor, I think, in terms of the frameworks. As I mentioned, the educational curricula, lecturing sound bites, the entertainment industry, gaming industry, and of course social media. And of course, the macro idea of the geopolitical machinations where some states, and it happens every day if you read the news carefully, misuse human rights, not because they care about it, but because it is useful for a particular geopolitical goal. And that actually is very sad, because it pollutes that. So when it's mentioned again, it doesn't ring true anymore, because people know that it's been misused. I'll stop here.
Yeah. So fundamentally 3 levels: the individual, the state, the international, the global. And I would like to continue asking you, Bruna, since you do come from a different perspective, and you've been working a lot on public responses to information about human rights violations, and you've been writing on acknowledgement and denial, and the nature of your research is qualitative. So the gaze or the scale of your analysis is very different from what Nayef has just suggested. How do you interact with what he has just said?
Okay, I have quite a different take on this, and I also want to bring in psychoanalysis. Being a psychoanalyst, obviously that's obvious, but if it's okay. So the first thing I want to say is that I feel very uncomfortable with these statements where somebody tells me who I am and that this is who we are. Takes away agency and frankly takes away hopes. It turns us into a very mechanistic entity, and I really want to resist this, whether it's true or not. In a way, mine is a political and ideological position. I do not want to be that. I don't recognize myself in that. And there are many, many examples of people doing things completely against their self-interest and indeed putting themselves in danger. For example, Germans saving Jews. It's a classic. But I also remember this documentary on human rights, and there was a Turkish torturer who had been torturing Kurdish people, prisoners, and because he had completely absorbed the narrative that these were the enemy of the state, the enemy of the country, until a boy was brought to him. And that's where he stopped. He just couldn't compute his own moral compass with having to torture a child. So I think in there what we see is not a lack of morality, it's a clash of moralities. Because somehow the boy represented innocence. And he couldn't carry on doing these terrible things that he was doing, feeling justified to those he perceived as the enemy, to somebody that he felt couldn't be an enemy. So for me, the question is, where do each one of us draw their moral boundaries? Who is within and who is without these moral boundaries? And I completely agree that the state and the narratives and the propaganda, the rhetoric, really pushes us towards moving these moral boundaries, excluding others all the time. And if you like, the human rights discourse is about universalizing those boundaries. Anybody should be within our moral field, and we should be responsible for each other, whatever the other one is. I think that's the main issue for me. So that's in terms of morality or non-morality. When it comes to feelings, again, I have a very different perspective. And I think we are in a very tricky position because, and the film we just watched is an example. What we see when we look at human rights violation is traumatic. It's really upsetting, it's really difficult. And our immediate reaction is to take in as much as we can and then to switch off. Now, the switching off is, for me, simultaneously what Freud used to call a homeostatic mechanism, which is that our brain, our mind shuts down when something is too difficult to comprehend or to absorb or to process even. We just shut down and we move away. And we see this in trauma, for example, where people, an interviewee described them as the walking dead. there is like a part of humanity that disappears because we cannot process certain things. But at the same time, I think that becomes itself a narrative. Oh, I can't look at that. I can't, it's too much for me. It would upset me. And that's where the sort of hijacking of human rights into a human individualistic right not to be bothered by the suffering of others becomes a different kind of narrative, which I think is also very powerful. So what do we do with this? This is my question. How do we help people listen to other people distant from us who are suffering tremendously in a way that we can take our responsibility, because we're not passive bystanders, we are not pure bystanders. In the geopolitical map, we are very well connected. Our wealth, what we profit from is other people's carrying out violations. So if we begin to make those links and connections, then we ought to be able to think, okay, how do I take responsibility? And that's where the cookie crumbles. Because between the rhetoric and the narratives and the attempt to or desire to switch off, and that there is very little solutions, there is the danger, as the film said, of helplessness. Feeling we are completely helpless, nothing can be done, and we might as well give up. And that's what we must resist. So my recommendation would be that something has to happen in the cognitive level. Violations have to be put in context, so we begin to see the links. They have to be emotionally manageable, but also we need to find recommended actions that they have a sense for people. They make people feel, actually, I made a difference. Because what we need is hope. Sorry, I hope I didn't go on for too long.
No, not at all. We are here for that. But I'm just stopping for a second, and for the wider public and guests online. We went from a more analytical view into a view that encompasses a normative dimension, which is also part of, probably of your background and what you do, and this gives me the opportunity to turn to you as an anthropologist and primatologist. And by the way, reading the articles that you have been and the interviews that you that I read, I noticed that there is this, probably because of your background and your expertise, there is a way of expecting that you will reply in a very dichotomical way, and you are boxed and forced almost to say things, oh, are humans good or evil? And I noticed that you try to resist as much as you can and try and be way more nuanced than that, and I would like to hear what you really think about what our colleagues just said.
Well, thank you. Okay, so if the question is, are humans good or evil, the answer is no, because we're both. And we're both, I think, in terms of our human nature. And the way in which I would draw attention to humans being good in a sort of rather fascinating way, from an intellectual point of view, is that all humans have a sense of right and wrong. And that includes a tendency to behave in ways that are good. So here I part ways with my esteemed colleague, Professor Al-Rodan. And I think you have to analyze morality in a rather peculiar way to say that humans are amoral. Because when I compare humans with chimpanzees have all the selfishness that humans do, but they don't have the extra goodness that comes from a morality of right and wrong. So if a chimpanzee in their own community, in the wild or in captivity, does something that would make us all feel terrible, kills a baby, is persistently violent against somebody else, there is no response by the rest of the community. There is no response by anyone saying the equivalent of, behaving in a way equivalent to saying, that is right, that is wrong, you need to be punished. Humans do have that tendency. Humans are born, it seems, with what we call a norm psychology. A psychology that recognizes what is an appropriate social norm within their culture and is predisposed to punish those who behave in contravention of the norms and to align their own behavior with the social norms. And we see this in the behavior of babies, where they're given the opportunity, pre-verbal babies, to watch a puppet show, and there's a good puppet and a bad puppet. And then it turns out that they like to interact subsequently with the good puppet. Chimpanzees don't do this. We come with this very special feature. So all other animals, I would agree with Professor Al-Radan, are amoral. They are purely selfish. But humans have got something extra. And we have a tension that has been recognized for years, but the great sociologist Emil Durkheim drew particular attention to it. A tension between our egoistic motivations and our altruistic motivations. So we are neither bad, if you want to say that our selfish behavior makes us bad, or totally good, if you want to say our recognition of right and wrong and our tendency to behave in ways that are right it happens. We are both. We have a tension between those. And I think that Bruna said it really well when she said that the really big question is, where do we set our moral boundaries? And what is responsible for where we set our moral boundaries? It's clear to me that if we go back into the distant past, then we see a species in which small, independent communities had within them thoroughly moral individuals who responded to each other with all sorts of goodness that you do not see in other animals, all sorts of willingness to self-sacrifice. And we also have theories about how that happened and why, but that doesn't matter. But they were moral within this very limited community. And now we're in a world that the world is one. And the question is, how persistently, how consistently can we extend those moral boundaries from the original very limited area into the rest of the world? And it's difficult, of course, but at least it's a perspective that we can see is possible.
So, Kate, in your years with the UN, how many times did you see this extra? And in that Richard was referring to, since you've been working in the realm of self-interest, where this extra is not supposed to be seen or to exist.
Well, the UN of today is not a great example of upholding that extra. I'm trying to remember whether I ever did see it clearly and unequivocally in the few years I was there recently. But it's worth recalling where the UN comes from. The UN didn't come as a privilege project, as a project of prosperity and wealth and peace and hope and optimism. No, it came from the very worst that human beings can do to each other, from the most abject horror, from when the smoke and the ashes were still settling on the grounds in Auschwitz and Treblinka and Dachau, when the bodies hadn't even been dug up in the jungles of South Asia. Still, people came around the table, met 200 times, delegates from all over the world. Yes, the countries soon to become post-colonial were not as represented at the table as they might be. But it was Saudi Arabia who argued for economic and social rights. It was Latin America who insisted that torture be put beyond the pale. It was the Philippines who argued for justice. And it was the United Kingdom and the US who tried to weaken the Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Human rights are an articulation of the powerless making claim on power. Get your boot off my neck. Make power accountable to justice. Ensure that if you have power over me, there are limits. And I personally believe that longing for justice is as powerful within us as is the hunger for food and the thirst for water. If any of you has 2 children at home, one 6, one 4, and you have tried to send the 6-year-old to bed before the 4-year-old, don't tell me we don't know what justice and injustice is and isn't. It is deep within us from the get-go. It does depend, as Bruno has said so powerfully, on what is the narrative and what is invited out of us and what is modelled to us. What is modelled to us today is a weak UN, treacherous, unreliable, betraying the essence of its charter in its vacuous leadership, its absence of standing up for rights. And in the meantime, around the table sit member states protecting their power motivated by greed and fear. That's what we're modelling to our children today. That is the problem. I refuse to believe that the hunger for justice and the ability of human beings to be the species of cooperators, not competitors, the greatest species for cooperation, I refuse to believe that that is not as intrinsic to us as is fear, selfishness and greed. Ask Steve Biko. Biko, who had been arrested time and time again and ultimately died in prison for standing up for rights in the face of the unconscionable regime of apartheid. Ask the Russian policeman who just last year, in front of the protests that were being suppressed by his colleagues and the instructions given to me, I'd rather strip off my uniform than have blood on my hands. And he did it. He took off his uniform, threw it in the dumpster and joined the march. Ask the nun in Myanmar who knelt down before the tanks and the raised guns, knelt down and said, "Shoot me," rather than the students standing behind me. How is that not authentically human? How is that not also biologically incentivized? How is that not just as real as being a selfish pig, of which there are plenty of other examples, and we don't have time for me to elaborate upon them, but many of them rhyme with dump. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So a final question to all of you before opening the floor to the public. So leaving aside the question of how hard it is or not, and I think that at least on this one there is agreement here. So what about the question of respecting these human rights? What does it take to make sure that we already individually, and I will start with you, Bruna, so the question of the respect itself of these human rights. And I will continue with you, because then the question of the amorality and morality, it's again at the 3 levels quite important. But first of all, you, Bruna.
Anything that I want to say?
Of course.
No, do you have any particular aspect? Okay, right. Okay, what I learned from my research, asking ordinary people about how they respond to information about human rights violation, is that first of all, there is a lot of confusion, and people varied from thinking that there were thousands of human rights principles and it was just too complicated to figure them out, to thinking that human rights had to do with the legalistic side, the International Criminal Court, and it's about punishment and so on and so forth, to those who felt that human rights had nothing to do with them because human rights are violated in countries like that. So, and this was felt very strongly. And of course, then you get, when you try to make the links, for example, that Britain is one of the biggest provider of weapons, and that, of course, is a big source of revenue, they would say, oh, but no, you're missing the point. We don't sell them, somebody else will, of course. And the second point is, if we don't sell them guns, they'll go back to sticks. So the idea that there is talking about dehumanization or believing that human rights are violated only by these primitive people that live over there, they have nothing to do with us. And that's where I was really trying to push very strongly the idea of connecting the links and really trying to question the idea of the innocent bystander, right? That we are not innocent bystander. And I think the triangle, the classic triangle where there is the victim, the perpetrator, and we're just watching, or the savior, actually should be changed to beneficiaries. And I think once you change the dynamic, then we're all involved. And then that's where the sort of respect of human rights and proclamation of human rights for all of us becomes really relevant. What are we doing?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes.
Yes. You know, I mentioned, when I talk about amorality, that doesn't equate with immorality. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't necessarily equate with morality. I mean, so it's a neutral position, whereby, depending on our individual and societal circumstances, we can oscillate between the two extremes. And I said also we have innate moral sensitivities, which means most of us, most of the time, will never accept wrongs happening to someone else. That is innate. There's no question about that. But that's not enough. That's my point. That's not enough for the individual to respect or proactively push to safeguard human rights of someone else. It needs other entities, i.e. societal constructs, societal frameworks, and it needs the global construct of geopolitical machinations. So I actually don't see it as an individual exercise. The individual is central to it, but the individual cannot do anything in the absence. One shouldn't be give up. We should all do what we can. But I think to be efficacious, the individual as an individual, in terms of groups, concerned citizens, NGOs, state constructs. And state constructs is not some prime minister or president saying, we're going to do this. It has to be in the structure of the society. In terms of the educational material, I'm repeating myself, but it's important. Educational curricula, you cannot preach, we have to do this and do this, and when you look at the curricula, there's all kinds of dehumanizing material, and there's all kinds of a skewed view glorifying your own history and instantaneously dehumanizing and minimizing someone else's history. The entertainment industry, for years, and that's politically motivated often. I mean, Hollywood and other movie making often isn't really neutral. It's sometimes persuaded, depending, and you can look back in the history. I mean, there were times in the 40s when certain groups were depicted in a very negative light.
The bad guys.
Yeah, the bad guys. Whether it was Germany or Japan. Then it moved on. It was the Soviets, and then it was this and that. So I think that's why I say being complacent about the virtues of human nature is a mistake. We're capable of great things, but we're also, can go with the flow. Most of us, depending on where we live. That's why societal frameworks, the milieu we find ourselves in, and especially if we grow up in certain entertainment industry of depicting someone else as less or as different. I mean, even in the narratives with the Ukraine crisis, you've all seen the clips where trains were moving to Germany or Poland and certain ethnicities were taken off the train. I mean, that's today. We're not talking about the 1930s. We're not talking about the 18th century. So, I'm I'm touched by all the wonderful things that humans are, but let's be grounded. I'd love the day where it's true. And I said this is not a reductionist or deterministic view. I made that very clear in the beginning.
Very clear.
But this is the kind of the Gaussian distribution, and I said moral selfless behavior is not the norm, is not the default position. That doesn't mean we're not capable of it. Of course we are. But I think we need more than our individual predilections to encourage us and to be more efficacious in that effort. And that's why society is critical. And even in the global system, the global system, you invade one country in 2003 and it's okay. And now there's an invasion, it's not okay. Well, an invasion is an invasion, it's an invasion. I mean, Kate is nodding because she's aware of these things. So you cannot have hypocrisy, you cannot have double standards, because then all of the wonderful things you say comes one ear, goes out the other. And if you have geopolitical machinations where you misuse human rights, just like you're misusing climate change, then you pollute these very sacred ideas that are important to all of us. And it was said that the world is one. It's absolutely one. From my international relations work, the world, we call it instantly connected and deeply interdependent, and becoming increasingly so. And therefore, we're all in it together. And I work on space security. It's even beyond Earth, even galactically. And the idea of zero-sum paradigms, which is central to the national interest of most states, doesn't work. Actually, it never ever worked in history. And power, when you're powerful as a state, the state, by the way, aspires to survive and take care of its citizens and their cultural frameworks and their resources and their borders. And then, beyond that, if they become more powerful, you aim to dominate and be hegemonous. That is the story of mankind. The UN, Kate wisely and elegantly said, is dysfunctional. It's absolutely dysfunctional. It's a club of the victors post-World War II. And by the way, the aim, and I work a lot on this, the aim of the UN is not to make the world more secure or just. The aim of the UN is for stability, so that there's less headache for the big boys, the big five, the P5. That's not going to change unless you restructure, but good luck, the UN. The UN has an unbelievably important role, because otherwise the world, as I said earlier, in the international relations term, it's a self-help system. It is free for all. There is no arbitration. Even the International Criminal Court, it's highly selective. I mean, how many people who should be there are there? Very few. So I think that's why, I may sound cynical, I may sound pessimistic. I'm pragmatic. I know the world. I study it. And I'd love to be we hug and kiss and make up and everything's wonderful. It's not. Let's not fool ourselves. Now, does that mean we're not capable of all of the above? Of course we are. But it will require a great deal of work. And never underestimate the role of each one of us. But it would take a lot more than each one of us to make a difference.
Thank you. Richard.
What was the question again?
It was on the respect of human rights.
The respect of human rights, yeah. It's difficult to keep focus when these answers are so elegant and compelling. So let me just say that I don't feel in a position to say much about this compared to the experts on this floor. Let me come back to the point about the relationship between men and women. There is very, very convincing data showing extraordinarily tight relationship between the status of women and the degree of violence in the society and the degree of propensity for war. And it seems to me that the link between these two, which is so clear in the data, should be somehow brought forward more than, at any rate, I have perceived it as being in human rights discussions. And it's very exciting that there are countries in the world in which the parliaments or the legislative bodies are roughly getting to 50-50 in some of the Scandinavian countries and enforced by a male in Rwanda. It's a great direction to be going in. It seems to me to be one that, for those of us who are interested in human rights, we should be pushing harder and more broadly across all levels of institutions.
I have a comment from Nayef, and I will conclude with Kate.
Yeah, I just want to pick up the very wise words I've just heard, which is the men-women issue when it comes to power, because we discussed power came up several times. In my book and in my work since, as I said, power is a highly addictive enterprise, and it turns out that there's a gender difference in terms of how we deal with power, which is very interesting. The central dominant neurochemical that underlies power is dopamine. And it's the central neurochemical in our mesolimbic system, which is the striatum, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the amygdala, which is where fear is regulated. But central to power is also testosterone, interestingly. So women, as you know, have testosterone, but very tiny amount of testosterone. Men have some estrogen, but a tiny amount of estrogens. And it turns out that estrogen, testosterone, pushes men to abuse power far more regularly than women can. It's very interesting. And women leaders, if you see around, are actually much more efficacious. I mean, it's a small sample, but hopefully we'll see more of it as we go along. So power is a troubling entity, especially even if it's checked power, interestingly. Unchecked power is a big problem, but checked power can be a problem. There are certain circumstances in history, I mean, Kate will know more about this than I, where even in accountable democratic societies, a certain prime minister got away with convincing through bilateral meetings of going to war and invading another country on false premises. That has happened. A lot of dead, a lot of maimed, a lot of economic chaos, and we're paying the price to this day. And we'll do so probably for the future decades. So the gender issue is critical, and I'm not trying to flagellate my fellow men, but it's really, there is something to be said for the balanced view that women deal with power when they are in a position of power.
Thank you. Kate.
If the proposition of this House is that men cannot be trusted with power, then I'm very happy to speak in favour of the proposition.
Right.
If effectively we have arrived at an understanding that it shall be deemed the case that thanks to testosterone we must no longer allow men, in particular old white men, to hover their chubby fingers over the red buttons of human destruction. And if that is to be the course of action of this House, may we indeed follow the fine example of the extraordinary courage of the students contesting against Hindu nationalism in India and take to the streets and so demand and so insist. It's just that in the meantime, while all men step away from all power, just while we're waiting for that, we need to put in place some common rules and some common understandings. We need to structure, codify, create typology for the dynamics between us. And that's all that human rights are. They are words on a page for the universal morality as opposed to the morality of these small separate communities from which we all come. And it is because we have not been able to trust other forms of morality. Shall we trust the French Catholic Church, the Libya of Christianity, for its assault on 300,000 children sexually? Shall we call that a morality to be trusted? Shall we hand it over to the pedophilia of the cardinals of church and commerce, thank you, Jeffrey Epstein, of culture and of the clubs and the concentrations of power? It simply cannot be done. In the meantime, whilst we come to terms with how we can hold power together collectively in a way that does not create the other, or diminish the powerless, or concentrate power in an unsustainable way that's taking us to the verge of extinction through the climate crisis because of fossil fuel and consumption in the West. In the meantime, what we have to have are rules obeyed, rules followed, and rules upheld. And human rights are not just airy-fairy ideas. They are international law. They're international humanitarian law. Even wars have laws. And human rights law prevails. There should not be targeting of civilians. There should not be targeting of civilian infrastructure. There should not be indiscriminate disproportionate use of force, and we should not be living in fear, waking up every morning wondering whether or not a dirty bomb has been dropped in the name of toxic masculinity, nationalism and militarism. This is Build Back Better from COVID. Thank you so much. I tell you what, P5 is a problem. I don't know about the P5 you were talking about. I do know what the problem is with the P5 and the Security Council and in the ineptitude of this system to live by the rules that are written down on the page and that every constitution, bar almost none, particularly in the post-colonial countries, have upheld, and every court has grappled with over these last 70 years. Human rights are known, they're set out, they're detailed, they're powerful, they offer us a way forward. Please, please, can we have some leadership for human rights? Please. Not question whether human rights are relevant. Please get on with leading for human rights. We need it. We're in trouble. We're in deep trouble.
On this note, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you to the four of you. We're going to open the floor for questions. Just give the panelists a minute to wear the headphones if they do, because maybe somebody will ask a question in French. And I think I have to hand over my mic. Yes. And I see 2 questions. Merci.
Hello. I'm going to ask a question in English, so can you hear me? Yep, okay. So some believe that the reason human rights are not respected in the current geopolitical situation is because there are not enough sanctions for not following them. What is your take on that? What do you think? Do you think that sanctions is the solution?
Sanctions is an overused word and methodology that I think creates more difficulty than it solves. I think this has to be, the problem with human rights is not something you can force. It's not top down. And as I said, most human beings will never object to being civil to each other. That's not the issue. The issue is really societal frameworks. I mean, I talked about the macro problem, the geopolitical machinations, and it is true. They have polluted the sanctity of human rights as a sacred exercise that we all need badly because of narrow geopolitical national interests. And that's not going to change anytime soon, sadly. So what do we do? So geopolitical machinations, we have no power over it. We have a dysfunctional UN. It's a self-help system. So forget that, but not forget that it's polluting the issue and making it more difficult, but we can't do much about it. So what can we do? We can do at the societal level. We can restructure our educational curricula. We can, without censorship, make our entertainment industry and gaming industry more responsible, more sensitive to ethnicities and theologies and histories. You know, decolonize curricula from all kinds of complexities that are inappropriate in today's world. You know, our leaders need to be a little more responsible in not use these inflammatory electioneering sound bites to get a few votes, and they create a lot of difficulty. So I think sanctions, the answer specifically to your question, I'm not a big fan of sanctions because I think it's highly selective, it's arbitrary, it is without due process, it's without thinking, and it's just a way of going to war without firing bullets. So it's an extension of war. It's an extension of conflict. So I don't think that's the way. The way is really, and you know, concerned citizens can play a great, we shouldn't leave it to the state. The state has enough on its hand, plus it has conflicting interests sometimes, even domestically. And it's up to groups, NGOs, concerned citizens, to build it up. As I said, the good news is that we have innate moral sensitivities. Nobody, unless they're really deranged and something is really bizarre with them, nobody is against the process. But how do you operationalize that? It needs groupings, it needs funding, it needs understanding, it needs commitment. The state is ultimately responsible, but the state in accountable societies cannot, you know, it's not a top-down issue. You cannot do that. It's the individual and the extension thereof.
I have a gentleman here, and 1, 2, 3, 4 people. Yes, I've seen you. I've seen you.
For all the food for thought which you have delivered, there are two embarrassing issues which are still unaddressed. One is, in the past 100 years, the worst horrors by far have been perpetrated by people with good intentions and ready to die for these good intentions. In that sense, Professor Yeshayahu Leibovitz, your colleague, said that the ethical man per excellence was Adolf Hitler. And the second issue, he said that, he wrote it. The second embarrassing issue is that for half a century, Gandhism has been the official gospel of India. And never again, for 3/4 of a century, has been the official gospel of the whole world. And today there are less dictatorships than ever, and both these gospels are collapsing. Why?
Good. Somebody? Okay. We're going to take a second one because we're going to take a second question because none of the panelists, but the point that you made is very clear. Sorry. The point that you made is very clear. I forgot the mic. There was a person over there. Sorry, I cannot see you very well. Yeah. And you in the back, yes, with a scarf.
Good evening. Thank you for the insightful speeches. I have two questions. So first of all, it was about power, which leads to, if people who have power, which we give power to, want to keep it because it's satisfying, because they have greed, right? Then are human rights not obsolete? Because if we want power, then we think that we are superior to another person. We have to. And then human rights are not useful anymore, right? So it's my first question. And the second one is about impunity. We talked about political framework, we talked about everything, but and we talked about sanctions, but impunity I think is the real problem at some point, because if there are no sanctions to one person who abused from their power, then if there is no sanction, we don't realize that he's abusing this power and he keeps his dominating position. So that's my second question. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think they're two very interesting observations. I think we just have to choose that in the absence of anything better, that human rights should prevail, and we should prevail with it. Why? It's not the fault of a promise if it's not kept. It's not the promise itself that is at fault. It is the promise maker. And even in the breach and the violation and the brokenness of the systems designed to uphold human rights, whether it's globally, nationally or locally, still you will find the most extraordinary courage coming from people. As we saw in the film, the most enormously brave exercises of demand and defence for human rights. In my time at the United Nations, I heard plenty of member states say human rights are passé. I had, plenty of meetings with ambassadors saying it's passé, it's been violated, it is applied hypocritically, it's not applied universally, the time of human rights is gone. I never heard a single victim of torture say that. I never heard anyone imprisoned without charge or without trial say that. I never heard a single person defending Indigenous land rights say human rights are irrelevant. I think we need to be very, very careful, because without that webbing between us, that description of what cooperation looks like, and we must remember, hardwired into us is this desire to be in community. Without some descriptor of functional community prevailing, what are we to have? What are we to fall back on? And you're damn right, there should be consequences. When adults in particular behave in ways that are cruel or harm another and have no consequence, we learn the wrong lesson to the peril of the other. There must be consequences. The tools for those consequences need to be better practiced. But part of the problem is the conflicts of interest in the systems of consequence. Sanctions are far from perfect. The International Criminal Court is also insufficient. But there are many other ways to uphold human rights, as civil society advises us all along. And I'm a little different, I think, in my nuance on this. Civil society is being brave. They're not waiting for changes in curriculum. Look at the students on the streets of every struggle for liberation, for colonisation. Look at Black Lives Matter. Look at the people on the streets of Belarus last year. I mean, civil society is not ambiguous about rights. It's absolutely clear to people that rights are our only way forward. It is power, it is unaccountable power, and it's power without consequence that is calling rights into question. Don't buy it, don't fall for it.
Thank you, Kate. I want to also nuance this idea of power, because I think there's almost an emergence of this discourse where there is either the power itself is the problem. The problem is the abuse of power. But I'm very fond of Judith Butler's quote that goes something like, we're born by power with power. We're shaped by historical forces and social forces that the color of our skin, where we're born in the world, which class we're born in, whether we're male or female indeed, really determines the way the access to a lot of things in the world. But we're also born with the capacity to resist and to push back. And I think this is really what we're talking about here. So the people depicted in the film, they didn't come across as powerless to me. They had a lot of power. So it's a relative thing and it's a relational thing. So this is what I think we really need to hold in mind. And what human rights do is, first of all, the state should be accountable for certain things never happening, end of. And second, for justice, because this is what the abuse of power comes down to. Injustice are committed, and so on. So I think we really need to move away from this idea that only these big men have power and we're trying to snatch it away and we're really powerless. That there is a lot going on, and Kate has kept reminding us there is a lot of people who are really fighting right now to uphold that sense of, no, we're not powerless, and we refuse to be powerless.
Richard?
Well, I just wanted to add to that, that in the days of social media, the ability of people to form groups and protest is greatly enhanced. And there are these studies by political scientist Erica Chenoweth, who has looked at protest movements that are violent versus those that are non-violent. And astonishingly, what she's found is that the non-violent movements are much more likely to be successful. So that's a really nice, hopeful point.
There was a question. Yes, I've seen the two people in the back, but there is, since she's right, she missed you. Right. With
the green blouse?
Yeah.
Merci de votre présence.
Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for this very interesting conversation. Can you hear me? Check. Can you hear the interpretation? Is it working? Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you for this very interesting conversation. I'm a Swiss journalist, and my question is the following. What is the role of comfort on the development of conformism, which makes people accept human rights violations on others who are less lucky than us?
I missed the beginning.
Est-ce que vous pouvez la répéter encore une fois, s'il vous plaît?
Oui, alors quel est le rôle du confort? Je veux dire par là de la...
So what is the role of comfort, having a comfortable life on the development of conformism? So how does that make people more tolerant to human rights abuses?
Shall I get that? Okay. I really don't want to generalize here, but I think what is really transpired from my studies with precisely on that area is that there is something about the protectiveness of one's sense of self, that we are good. So in that way, in a way, almost agree with what you're saying, that the whole idea of completely selfless altruism has to be unpacked and understood better. We want to appear always to be doing the right thing, and that we are always good people, because this is what internally our ego ideal is, what we strive towards. We want to be our ideal. And that, of course, where the cookie crumbles, because, and I give a classic example, if we think about modern slavery, for example, how prepared are we to give up the cheap goods that are prepared? They're cheap because they're people that are basically enslaved or really deeply exploited. So that's where the denial discourses really come in. And it goes from a complete reversal, which is actually we are still the good guys because we're giving them jobs, to all sorts of other things. Oh, but I give to charity, or it's more complicated than that. They're oppressed by their leaders. And that's where I go back to the beginning about the kind of disconnecting that actively we do every day, in the everyday, really, the morality that wants to disconnect from the bigger picture and wants to disconnect emotionally, but also cognitively. And then we wrap it up in a different way that is not so uncomfortable. I don't know whether that answers the question, but I think there is a big element of that.
Thank you. And just to appreciate the question, I think you've put your finger on the great challenge for social change going forward is, what are we to do about the West? What are we to do about ourselves, people like us? We're the ones who've imperiled the planet, actually. It's our greed and our consumption and our pleasure and our comfort. And how do we problematize that? Where is the sustainable development goal on greed? And if I were to retrospectively critique human rights, and I think it is because some of the narrative most powerfully led has come from North America, it is the trumping of freedom over equality. It is a lack of balance in the application of human rights and the discourse that has left us unfocused on the travesty of inequality. And until we're ready to put inequality at the centre, not just our freedom, but inequality by race, by caste, by class, this unconscionable concentration of wealth. How is it that after the 2008 financial crisis, a handful of men, their billions became trillions? And the 50% of the poorest of the world got poor. I mean, 50% of the world that is poor got poorer. I'm not making much sense, but you know exactly what I mean, even though I'm not making sense. And until we say that is the problem, we will not be human rights loyal. Until we deal with the legacy of 400 years of cross-Atlantic slavery, we will not be working with human rights. Until we own that the wealth of Europe is rooted in the exploitation of the global south and that redress must be made, there shall be no human rights. But it's not human rights' fault per se. It is how we have failed, particularly in the West, I'm afraid, to live up to the fact that our privilege, our wealth and our prosperity comes from standing on the backs and grinding the backs of others into the earth. And what we don't have is political systems, and we clearly don't have a United Nations capable and competent to reframe those problems and go about systematically solving them in human rights terms.
Thank you. Let's take the last two questions. There was one, and the other one was over there. She has been waiting. Yes, let's take them together. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this great debate. I think my question actually is a nice follow-up to the one we just heard. I work for a Tibetan NGO, and I should caveat that I am the only person who is from the global north in that NGO. My question is, we're seeing more and more that people are rejecting language around human rights. They're increasingly seen as bourgeois Western values. And if the sanctity of human rights have been polluted for narrow nationalistic interests...
I cannot hear you. Can you speak?
Oh, sorry. If the sanctity of human rights have been polluted for narrow nationalistic interests, and people are rejecting that language, what language should human rights defenders use to try to mobilize the public? Is there value in using or defending the specific language of human rights as they've been enshrined in their various covenants and declarations? Or should we pursue other lines of rhetoric? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take the last one. Over there. Yeah.
My question is, I think, a little bit linked to the film and a moment that for me connected the title of the panel with the movie, and it's when Elle had written, you stood there shouting slogans with me, but then you went home and you couldn't stand up to your parents. And that to me seemed like, maybe that's why it's often hard. And I wondered, without making this too much of a personal question, how you have perhaps in your lives approached that kind of moment where something like human rights is bound up in people whose not just power is tied up with yours, but their affection and the boundaries of the life that you've built in one way is challenged by a human rights concern.
Who would like to take these two questions or one of those?
I'm not quite sure I will address your question directly, but for me, you raised two issues. One is whether the language and the rhetoric of human rights needs revamping or a change of direction. And I think we need to nuance that, because there is something about the rights that don't need any revamping, but what urgently we need to do, in my view, is to make them relevant now. And the kind of, in many ways you might say, this is where I resist the concept of human nature is always the same story, but actually it's not really. And we need to update the language in a way that speaks to people. And that's also what I meant about the moral boundaries. It has to become integrated somehow and meaningful to people in their everyday, as other things are. Have managed to do that. Now, in terms of NGOs, I think it's very complex, very, very complex, because there is a very powerful rhetoric which in a way trumps everything else. And what the public says, all they want is my money. And I have been trying to find a middle ground between these two tensions, which is, on one hand, the public saying, all they want is my money, and the NGO saying, actually, yes, all we want is your money, because we are the expert and we are the only one who can provide the specialist input and intervention. Forgetting for a moment that they are becoming very corporate, and it is actually the smaller NGOs who are really making inroads in getting people on board in a different way. But there are differences. I think the issue is that we somehow lost the grassroots connection. And that's where, for example, Harmonie started, that's where the meaningfulness was inbuilt in the way you would speak about these issues. And that is somehow been disassociated. Again, we need to reconnect, we need to make links alive again and meaningful for the new era, for the era we're in. So it's a complex answer, that's all I'm saying.
Thank you. Would you like to address the last one? Or both of them?
Yeah, if I might just, because I think it was a very profound question, the last one, and important, but I feel utterly shallow in its face, and I don't know what I would say. But I was very taken by just the second question, and to say, or the first question is to say, which human rights exactly, and which people? Should we just let go the right not to be tortured? Or perhaps we can let go of the right to education? Or shall we let go of the right to form a family? Or my favourite right, which I think is Article 23 or 24, the right to leisure. Exactly what is it about rights that people think is Western? Because that's historically incorrect. I mean, please get someone who says that to just sit down and read a history book to discover just how non-Western were the formulation of modern rights and the long tradition of claims for rights, from the Cyrus scroll in before the Common Era to the Ashuk pillar of the 1st century, through to the Mandan Charter, the oral Mandan Charter of Africa, which promised, in fact, gender equality in the 13th and 12th century, right through. So, I mean, I dislike intensely the easy and casual rhetoric that has been attached to rights. And I suspect it's part of the opposition to the idea that born we all are free and equal in rights. So that's the first thing. Which rights shall we let go of and soften claim to? I don't want to have it softened, the right not to be raped. I don't really find any other language to describe that I have a right not to be subjected to sexual violence. My children have a right to housing and have a right to water. So I always want to say to people, exactly what are you talking about? Which rights? And for whom should they be denied? It doesn't mean that you can't be smart. Human rights in the end of the day are principles. That's different from a strategy, which is different from tactics. By all means be tactical, but never to the extent that you've broken the golden thread to the principle. There is no tactical accommodation for the death penalty. There simply isn't. Because people are uncomfortable with the idea of being subjected, having your physical and mental integrity attacked by the police, that we should forget that that's a violation of rights? That's a very slippery path, and we shouldn't fall for it again. But it's not to say that there aren't people like, I believe, what's his name? Putin, is that what his name is? Who said, oh yes, rights are dead, and the Western liberal order has come to a close, and it's time we put all that nonsense of rights to one side. You can see where that concept leads to, huh? Just open a newspaper.
On this note, I would like to thank the panelists and the public for your question, for your comments. And I'd like to thank the FIFDH. And I think we are going to enjoy probably a night of knowing nothing. Thank you. Yes, thank you.